Before we continue, if stories about silence, grief, and the things people never say speak to you, please subscribe to Hidden Angle Podcast. This space is for the quiet truths we rarely hear out loud. And now, let's continue. He didn't raise his voice. That was the first thing that made it hurt more. He didn't yell. He didn't slam the door. He just said it, slowly, calmly, as if he had already decided. "I know what you did." The room went quiet. Not the peaceful kind. The kind that makes your chest tighten because you know something has just broken, and it won't sound like glass. She looked at him. She waited for the rest of the sentence. For proof. For anger. For emotion. But there was none. Just an accusation, delivered like a conclusion. In that moment, she understood something painful. He wasn't asking. He wasn't curious. He had already written the story, and she was guilty in it. Her first instinct was to defend herself. To explain. To say his name the way she used to, when it still meant safety. But her body didn't move. Because the truth was heavier than the accusation. What he saw as betrayal was grief. A quiet grief she had been carrying alone. A loss she never found the right words for. A pain that didn't announce itself, only hollowed her out slowly. She wasn't cheating. She was disappearing. Not from him, but from herself. And standing there, being accused of something she didn't do, hurt less than realizing something else. He had never noticed she was already gone. That was the moment the accusation landed. Not on her actions, but on the silence between them. And in that silence, something shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, but in a way that would change everything. To what she didn't defend. She could have defended herself. The words were there. Clear, accurate, enough to erase the accusation. She knew exactly what to say. She could have listed dates. Explained absences. Corrected the story he had already written in his head. But she didn't. Not because she was guilty. And not because she didn't care. She didn't defend herself because something in her recognized this moment. She had been explaining herself for years. Explaining why she was tired. Why she needed space. Why she felt distant without knowing how to fix it. She had explained her sadness when it was still quiet. Before it became grief. Before it turned into something she carried alone. And each time, the response was the same, not cruel. Just absent. A nod without curiosity. Silence without follow-up. Presence without engagement. So when the accusation came, something inside her stopped reaching outward. Not in anger. In exhaustion. She realized she wasn't afraid of being misunderstood. She was tired of being unseen. Defending herself would have meant hoping, again, that this time he would really listen. That he would ask the one question that mattered. How are you really doing? But he didn't ask. He assumed. And in that assumption, she saw the truth she had been avoiding. This wasn't about betrayal. It was about emotional distance that had grown so wide. It started filling in its own explanations. So she stayed quiet. Not as punishment. Not as strategy. But because defending herself would have required energy she no longer had. Her silence wasn't an admission. It was a boundary she didn't know she was drawing. And for the first time, she chose not to translate her inner world into words for someone who hadn't learned how to hear them. Free the kind of absence that hurts. There is a kind of absence that doesn't look like leaving. No packed bags. No slammed doors. No final goodbyes. It happens quietly. While two people still share the same space. He was there. He came home. He sat across from her at dinner. And yet, she felt alone in ways she couldn't explain. This kind of absence hurts differently because you're not allowed to grieve it. When someone leaves, the loss has a shape. But when someone stays without truly being present, the loss becomes invisible. She started noticing the pauses. How her words landed and didn't echo back. How her feelings were acknowledged but never explored. How conversations ended before they reached anything real. He listened, but only to the surface. He responded, but never followed her deeper. And slowly, she learned which parts of herself were welcome, and which were inconvenient. She stopped sharing the thoughts that needed patience. Stopped naming the emotions that required effort to hold. Not because she didn't trust him, but because she didn't want to feel like a burden. This is the kind of abandonment no one warns you about. Being emotionally alone while physically together. Being loved in theory, but not in experience. She didn't feel rejected outright. She felt postponed. As if her inner world could always wait. As if her pain wasn't urgent enough to interrupt his emotional distance. And over time, that waiting changed her. She became quieter. More careful. Less visible. Not because she wanted to disappear, but because she learned that disappearing caused less friction than asking to be seen. This absence didn't announce itself. It seeped in through unreturned questions. Through eye contact that drifted away. Through moments where she needed connection, and received reassurance instead. And reassurance, she learned, is not the same as presence. That's the absence that hurts the most. The one where no one leaves. But you lose yourself anyway. For abandonment without goodbye. Abandonment doesn't always come with an ending. Sometimes, there is no last conversation. No moment where someone says, "I'm leaving." It happens in fragments. In the way messages get shorter. In how questions stop being asked. In how care becomes optional instead of instinctive. She didn't notice it all at once. At first, she told herself he was tired. Busy. Stressed. She learned to wait. To give him space without asking when he would return emotionally. To lower her needs so they wouldn't feel inconvenient. That's how abandonment without goodbye begins. Not with rejection, but with accommodation. She stayed. She adjusted. She made herself easier to be with. And each time she did, something quietly left her. Not love. Not loyalty. Expectation. She stopped expecting him to notice the change in her voice. Stopped expecting him to ask why she no longer laughed the same way. Stopped expecting him to reach for her when she went silent. Not because she didn't want those things, but because wanting them had started to hurt. There was no clear moment she could point to and say, "This is when I was abandoned." Because he never walked away. He just faded. His attention became intermittent. His presence conditional. His care something she had to earn with patience. And grieving that kind of loss feels confusing. How do you mourn someone who is still in the room? How do you explain a pain that doesn't have a date? So she blamed herself. Maybe she asked for too much. Maybe she should be easier. Quieter. Less emotional. But the truth was simpler and harder to face. She wasn't abandoned because she needed too much. She was abandoned because she needed presence. And presence was the one thing he didn't know how to give. 5. How she learned to be quiet. She didn't become quiet all at once. It happened in small corrections. In the pause before she spoke. In the sentence she decided not to finish. In the feelings she edited before letting them out. At first, it felt considerate. She told herself she was being understanding. That she was choosing peace. That silence was a form of maturity. But silence, repeated often enough, becomes instruction. She learned which emotions were safe to share. and which ones created distance. Joy was acceptable if it wasn't too loud. Sadness was tolerated if it passed quickly. Anything that required attention, she kept to herself. Not because she didn't feel deeply, but because she learned that depth came at a cost. Every time she opened up and felt him pull away, her body remembered. So she adjusted. She stopped asking questions that led nowhere. Stopped naming needs that sounded like demands. Stopped explaining why she felt the way she did. She became fluent in self-containment, holding emotions without letting them spill, swallowing words before they asked to be heard. And slowly, quiet became her default. Not the peaceful kind, but the careful kind. The kind that watches before it speaks. That checks the room before it breathes. She wasn't hiding. She was adapting. Adapting to a space where presence was unpredictable. Where connection felt conditional. Being quiet meant fewer misunderstandings. Less disappointment. Less evidence that she needed more than was available. But there was a cost she didn't see at first. Silence began to erase her edges. She forgot what it felt like to be fully expressed. To speak without rehearsing. To feel without translating. She didn't lose her voice. She trained it to stay inside. And the longer it stayed there, the harder it became to recognize what she was even feeling. That's how she learned to be quiet. Not as submission. Not as weakness. But as a way to survive an environment where her inner world had no place to land. 6. Grieving while being seen. She was grieving in plain sight. Not the kind of grief people recognize. No funeral clothes, no public tears, no missing work. Her grief had no permission to be visible. It lived in the smallest places. In the way she stared a second too long at nothing. In the way her hands shook when she poured coffee. In the way she held her breath when someone asked, "How are you?" Because the honest answer didn't fit into conversation. The loss wasn't something she could explain quickly. It wasn't neat. It wasn't the kind of pain that earns sympathy. It was the kind that sits in your chest and makes everything else feel distant. And still, she had to be seen. She had to smile at the grocery store, answer emails, show up to dinner. She had to sit across from him, while her heart quietly went somewhere else. That's what grieving while being seen does. It forces you to perform stability, while your inner world is collapsing. She learned to make her face look normal, to swallow emotion before it reached her throat, to blink slowly when tears tried to rise. She became an expert in invisibility, because if she showed her grief, she feared two things. First, he would minimize it. Not on purpose, but in that familiar way. With a solution instead of a hand. With logic instead of presence. And second, he would finally notice her pain. And ask questions she wasn't ready to answer. Questions that would turn her private grief into a shared reality. She wasn't ready for that. So she kept it quiet. She grieved with the shower running. With the car radio louder than necessary. With her phone face down, as if silence could keep her from falling apart. And the strangest part was this. People praised her for being strong. They said it like it was a compliment. But strength wasn't what she felt. She felt trapped. Trapped inside a version of herself that looked fine from the outside. And sitting there, being watched, being known only on the surface, she realized grief didn't just take what she lost. It took her ability to be reached. 7. Emotional unavailability as a pattern. It wasn't that he didn't care. That's what made it confusing. He showed up in practical ways. Paid bills. Fixed problems. Remembered appointments. He knew how to be responsible. He just didn't know how to be emotionally present. And the more she tried to reach him, the clearer the pattern became. When feelings entered the room, he tightened. When she needed softness, he offered solutions. When she needed to be held, he became efficient. Not cold, just trained. As if emotion was something you manage, not something you sit with. She started noticing how quickly he redirected. If she said, "I'm not okay," he'd ask, "What do you need me to do?" If she said, "I feel lonely," he'd reply, "But I'm here, aren't I?" His words weren't cruel. They just didn't land where her pain lived. Because emotional unavailability isn't always silence. Sometimes it's talking without touching the truth. Sometimes it's being present in the room while staying absent in the moment. And once she saw it, she realized it wasn't new. This was how he moved through life. He avoided mess, avoided vulnerability, avoided anything that might expose him. Not because he was selfish, but because he was afraid of what he'd feel if he opened the door. He had learned early that feelings make you weak. That needs make you dependent. That tenderness costs too much. So he stayed in control. Control was his love language. And in that way, he could love her without risking himself. He could care, as long as she didn't ask him to enter what was uncertain. But grief is uncertain. Grief doesn't fit into a plan. It doesn't resolve with logic. It doesn't disappear because someone says, "It'll be fine." Grief asks for presence. And presence was the one place he didn't know how to live. So she stopped pushing. She stopped asking him to meet her where he couldn't. And that's the tragedy of patterns like this. No one is trying to hurt the other. But both people keep bleeding in silence. 8. When love requires less of you. Love didn't ask her to leave. It asked her to shrink. At first, it was subtle. A softer opinion. A quieter reaction. A decision not to bring something up, just this once. She told herself it was compromise. That this is what mature love looks like. Meeting in the middle. Choosing harmony over friction. But the middle kept moving. Each time she adjusted, the space widened. And she became the one expected to adjust again. She noticed how relief entered the room. Only after she made herself smaller. When she didn't mention what hurt. When she said, "It's fine," and meant, "I can carry it." When she laughed at moments that deserved to be taken seriously. He seemed calmer then. More available. More affectionate. And without realizing it, she learned the equation. Less of her meant more peace. So she offered less. Less honesty. Less need. Less presence. She filtered her thoughts before they reached her mouth. Measured her emotions so they wouldn't tip the balance. Rehearsed conversations in her head, then decided not to have them. Not because she didn't want connection, but because connection came with a condition. Be lighter. Be easier. Be less. And that's when love quietly changed shape. It stopped being a place where she arrived fully and became a place she visited carefully. She didn't feel chosen anymore. She felt tolerated. As if her full self was too much to hold. But a diluted version was acceptable. And the hardest part wasn't the loss of expression. It was the confusion. Because nothing looked wrong from the outside. There were no fights. No ultimatums. No obvious cruelty. Just a slow exchange. Her fullness for stability. And one day, she realized something that frightened her. She no longer knew where she ended. And where the relationship began. Because when love requires less of you, it doesn't break you all at once. It teaches you to disappear. One reasonable adjustment at a time. 9. The cost of staying silent. Silence has a cost. Not the quiet that feels peaceful, but the quiet you choose to survive. At first, the cost felt small. A conversation avoided. A feeling swallowed. A need postponed. But silence doesn't stay small. It accumulates. It collects in your body like tension you stop noticing. In your throat when you want to speak but don't. In your chest when you smile through something that hurts. And slowly, it changes how you see yourself. She began to doubt her own reality. Not because he gaslit her, but because her truth had nowhere to land. When you speak and nothing meets you, eventually you stop trusting your voice. She started asking herself questions she never used to ask. Am I too sensitive? Am I overreacting? Is this normal? She became her own editor, her own judge. And the more she stayed silent, the more invisible she became, even to herself. Because silence doesn't just hide pain. It hides needs. It hides boundaries. It hides the parts of you that require care. So she kept adjusting. She learned to read his moods like weather. To predict storms. To stay small when the air felt tense. She learned to carry the emotional weight, so he wouldn't have to feel uncomfortable. And that kind of love can look devoted. But inside, it feels like disappearing. The cost showed up in unexpected places. In how tired she felt after a normal day. In how she couldn't cry when she finally had privacy. In how her body stayed on alert even when nothing was happening. Because her nervous system had learned. Being seen is risky. Needing is dangerous. Speaking changes things. So she stopped speaking. And that's the cruelest part of staying silent. You think you're keeping the relationship safe. But what you're really doing is slowly teaching yourself that your inner world doesn't matter. And one day, you wake up and realize you didn't just lose the conversation. You lost access to your own truth. 10. Why she didn't leave. People always ask the same question when they hear a story like this. Why didn't she just leave? As if leaving is simple. As if your heart comes with an emergency exit sign. She didn't leave because she wasn't only living in the present. She was living in the beginning. In the version of him that once looked at her like she mattered. In the nights he stayed up with her, talking softer than the world. In the small moments that felt like proof. And when someone has been that person to you, even briefly, your mind keeps waiting for them to return. She didn't leave because hope can look like loyalty. Because she kept telling herself, he's stressed, he's overwhelmed, he'll come back to me. And every time he gave her a good day. One warm touch, one sincere apology, 1 hour of closeness. It reset the clock. It made her doubt the bad days. It made her question her own pain. Maybe I'm exaggerating. Maybe I'm too sensitive. Maybe this is just what adulthood looks like. She didn't leave because she had already adjusted so much that leaving felt like admitting the adjustment was for nothing. All the patience. All the swallowing. All the nights she cried quietly and still showed up the next morning. Walking away would have meant facing a terrifying truth. That love, by itself, didn't save her. And she didn't leave because she understood him. Not as an excuse, but as a map. She saw how he avoided feelings. How he panicked when things got too intimate. How his distance was sometimes fear wearing a suit. So she tried to be gentle. She tried to be the safe place. She believed if she stayed calm enough, soft enough, patient enough, he would finally feel safe enough to meet her. But there was another reason she didn't leave. The one no one talks about. She didn't leave because she was already half gone. When you've been emotionally alone for long enough, you stop trusting your ability to start over. You start to believe this is as good as it gets. And you stay, not because you're weak, but because your nervous system is tired of losing. So she stayed. Not for drama. Not for pity. She stayed because leaving requires certainty. And she had been trained to doubt herself. 11. Naming the real loss. For a long time, she thought the pain was about him. About what he didn't do. What he didn't say. What he wouldn't give. But the deeper she went, the clearer it became. The real loss wasn't him. It was the feeling of being chosen. Not chosen in public. Not chosen in status. Chosen in the quiet moments. When your heart is open and a person stays with you. She realized she had been grieving something invisible. She wasn't grieving the relationship as a label. She was grieving what it promised her in the beginning. A safe place. A soft landing. A sense that her inner world mattered. And when that disappeared, she didn't just lose love. She lost orientation. Because being chosen does something to your nervous system. It tells your body, you can exhale here. But when that choice becomes inconsistent, when affection is conditional, when attention is intermittent, your body stops resting. You start living in readiness. Ready to be disappointed. Ready to be misunderstood. Ready to apologize for feelings you didn't create. She named another loss too. The loss of being known. Not his knowledge of her schedule or habits, but his knowing of her pain. She had sat beside him with a storm inside. And he had spoken to her like the weather was clear. That is a specific kind of loneliness. The kind where you're not unseen by everyone. Only by the person you wanted to see you most. And finally, she named the loss she had avoided. She had lost herself. Not dramatically. Not all at once. But quietly, through small compromises that stacked up. She had stopped asking, what do I feel? And started asking, what is safe to feel? That's when she understood. The grief she carried wasn't just about what she lost back then. It was about what she had been losing every day she stayed silent. The right to be fully human in love. 12. The moment he misunderstood. The moment he misunderstood her wasn't loud. It was ordinary. It happened in the space between a question and an answer. She came home later than usual. Not by hours, by minutes. But minutes are enough when someone is already looking for a reason. He didn't ask if she was okay. He watched her. The way her eyes avoided his. The way she held her phone too tightly. The way she went straight to the sink, as if water could wash off a feeling. And in his mind, those details formed a story. Not because he knew the truth, but because he didn't know her grief. When a person doesn't understand your pain, they will interpret your silence through their own fear. He didn't see a woman breaking inside. He saw distance, secrecy, a closed door. And he named it the only way he knew how. Betrayal. Because betrayal is easier to hold than helplessness. If she was cheating, then he could be angry. He could blame. He could act. But if she was grieving, then he would have to feel something he didn't have language for. He would have to face the fact that he had missed her suffering. That he had been in the room. And still not been there. So his mind protected him. It gave him a story where he was the victim, not the witness. And she stood in front of him, hearing the accusation, and realized something sharp. He wasn't reading her. He was reading his own abandonment wound. Because emotional unavailability often comes with a hidden fear. That if you get too close, you'll lose control. So when she pulled inward, not away from him, but into her grief, his nervous system called it danger. And the tragedy is this. Two people can be hurting at the same time. And still harm each other. Not with cruelty. With misunderstanding. And in that moment, his misunderstanding didn't just mislabel her silence. It erased the real reason she was quiet. 13. When she finally spoke, inside. She didn't speak out loud. Not to him. Not that night. She went quiet the way people do, when they realize words won't rescue them. But inside, something finally spoke. It wasn't a dramatic speech. It wasn't a brave declaration. It was a simple, honest sentence she had avoided for too long. I am lonely here. Not lonely because she lacked company. Lonely because she lacked contact. Because even when he was near, she couldn't reach him. And she couldn't be reached. She sat with that truth like it was fragile. And then another sentence followed, softer but sharper. I keep shrinking to stay loved. That was the moment she realized. She had confused endurance with devotion. She had been proud of how much she could handle. How little she asked for. How calm she stayed. But calm wasn't peace. Calm was survival. She thought of all the times she swallowed her feelings and called it maturity. All the times she accepted good enough. Because she was afraid to discover what life looked like without him. And then her inner voice said something she didn't expect. You don't have to prove you deserve presence. That sentence landed like relief. Because she had been auditioning for love. Trying to be easy enough, light enough, low maintenance enough, to earn the kind of emotional closeness that should never have been earned. She looked back at the accusation, and for the first time, she didn't feel the urge to defend herself. Not because she didn't care what he thought, but because she finally cared what she knew. She knew her silence wasn't deception. It was grief. It was exhaustion. It was her nervous system going numb from being alone beside someone for too long. And in that private conversation inside her chest, she made a quiet decision. I will stop abandoning myself. Not in anger. Not with drama. Just with clarity. Because the truth was, she had been waiting for him to choose her, while she kept refusing to choose herself. 14. Letting go without drama. Letting go didn't look like a speech. There was no announcement. No confrontation. No moment where she finally said everything she'd been holding. It looked ordinary. She stopped waiting for his texts to decide how her day would feel. Stopped rehearsing explanations in her head. Stopped asking questions that only led her back to the same silence. Nothing dramatic changed. Except her attention. She began to place it where it had been missing. On herself. She answered messages without urgency. Left conversations when they started draining her. Chose rest over proving she was easy to love. She didn't withdraw to punish him. She withdrew to protect her nervous system. And that distinction mattered. Letting go without drama meant she didn't need him to understand. Didn't need validation. Didn't need an apology to move forward. She released the need to be witnessed by someone who had already shown her their limits. Instead, she became quieter in a different way. Not the quiet of suppression, but the quiet of boundaries. She no longer filled the gaps with effort. No longer smoothed over discomfort. No longer made herself smaller to keep the peace. Peace, she learned, isn't something you negotiate for. It's something you choose. There were moments it felt strange. When she didn't rush to explain herself. When she didn't chase clarity. When she let misunderstandings remain uncorrected. But clarity had already arrived, inside her. And that was enough. Letting go without drama meant accepting that closure doesn't always come from conversation. Sometimes it comes from consistency. From choosing yourself again and again. Until it feels normal. She didn't leave in anger. She left in alignment. 15. Quiet healing. Healing didn't arrive like relief. It arrived like silence that finally felt safe. No fireworks. No sudden happiness. Just a small, unfamiliar calm. The kind that feels almost suspicious at first. Because when you've lived on emotional alert for too long, peace can feel like emptiness. She noticed it in her body before she noticed it in her thoughts. Her shoulders dropped without permission. Her jaw unclenched. She slept through the night and woke up confused by the absence of dread. There was still grief. But it wasn't the sharp, public kind. It was private. Soft edge. Like a bruise you stop pressing. She began doing ordinary things differently. She ate without rushing. Walked without checking her phone. Sat in her car for a minute before going inside. Just to breathe, just to return to herself. She stopped explaining her feelings to someone who met them with distance. And in that space, her feelings stopped needing to scream to be real. Quiet healing isn't about forgetting. It's about remembering yourself without panic. She started to hear her own inner voice again. The one that had been drowned out by, "Be patient," and "Don't make it worse." It wasn't loud. It was gentle. It said things like, "You're allowed to rest. You're allowed to be disappointed. You're allowed to want warmth and not apologize for it." Some days, she still reached for old habits. To check if he had softened. To see if there was finally an apology waiting. To hope that what hurt her would be named. But then she would catch herself. And choose the new habit instead. Not chasing. Not proving. Not negotiating for presence. She learned that healing is often just repetition. Choosing yourself in small ways until your body believes you. And slowly, the abandonment inside her began to fade. Not because he changed, but because she stopped leaving herself behind. 16. Release. What her grief taught you. Release didn't happen in a single moment. It happened the way dawn happens. Quietly, almost without permission. One day she realized she could breathe again. Without waiting for someone else to soften. And that was the lesson her grief taught her. You can love someone and still release them. Because love is not the same as being chosen. And loyalty is not the same as abandoning yourself. Her grief wasn't only about what she lost. It was about what she finally understood. That emotional abandonment doesn't always look like leaving. Sometimes it looks like staying. But never arriving. It looks like being touched without being held. Like being heard without being met. Like being fine because no one asks for more truth. And if you've lived through that, you know how confusing it is to grieve someone who is still there. But here's what she learned in the quiet healing. You don't have to fight for presence. Presence is either offered, or it isn't. You don't have to shrink to be lovable. The right kind of love expands you. It gives your nervous system permission to rest. It makes you feel chosen in the small moments, not just the big ones. Her release wasn't revenge. It was clarity. She stopped begging for what should have been natural. Stopped translating her pain into softer words. Stopped making herself smaller so the relationship could feel larger. She didn't leave with drama. She left with dignity. And the most honest part of the story is this. He accused her of betrayal. But what she was grieving changed everything. Not because it proved him wrong, but because it finally proved her right. Right about her loneliness. Right about her needs. Right about the quiet truth she had been swallowing for too long. If this story reached something in you, if you've ever been made to feel too much for wanting presence, I want you to remember this. You are not too much. You were just asking the wrong person. Thank you for listening. If you'd like more stories like this, soft, honest, and quietly powerful. Please like this video, share it with someone who needs it, and comment below. Have you ever grieved someone who was still in the room? And don't forget to subscribe to Hidden Angle Podcast for more untold truths, the kind we only hear when we finally get quiet enough to feel.